Distinguished delegates, I would like to start the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all and to declare open this special virtual session of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. I wish to thank the Executive Secretary and her staff for the wonderful preparations made for this special session. I also wish to thank the Bureau of the Conference of the Parties for its support. As you know, the 24th meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice and the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation will be convened to provide governments from around the world an opportunity to develop timely advice for the Conference of the Parties and its other subsidiary bodies. However, the COVID pandemic has led to repeat delays in the scheduling for SBSTTA and SBI. The physical meetings will now be held in the first quarter of 2021, conditions allowing. And for both Europe, are also considering possible virtual discussions beforehand. Therefore, this series of special virtual sessions seeks to facilitate preparations for the meetings of the subsidiary bodies. The further aim of these virtual sessions is to help maintaining momentum ahead to the UN's Biodiversity Summit, which will be held at the end of this month, and towards COP15 in China next year. These special virtual sessions will provide opportunities for the presentation of information and for statements by parties and observers. No decisions or formal recommendations will be made at these special sessions. Interpretations will be provided in our UN languages. The program of these special virtual sessions will include today, special session on SBSTTA 24 to launch the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, a special session of SBI for testing a party-led review process through an open-ended forum, which will be held on the 16th and 17th September, a special session of SBI focused on the strategy for resource mobilization, which will be held on 17 September, and a special joint session of SBSTTA and SBI on 18 September that will focus on the preparation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let us turn to the focus of our special session today, the launch of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Framework. In Decision 1435, the Conference of the Parties requests the Executive Secretary to prepare the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, including a summary for policymakers, on the basis of an agreed plan and indicative timetable. The timetable envisages that GBO will be launched at the opening of SBSTTA 24. However, since SBSTTA meeting is postponed, we like to keep the momentum during this important period when we are all working on developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We're launching this important report virtually to enable parties and observers to make use of this report in their preparation for SBSTTA 24 and SBI, as well as other work related for the development of post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This will also ensure that the report will be launched ahead of the United Nations Biodiversity Summit, which will be convened virtually by the President of the General Assembly on 30 September of this year. We're very pleased to have with us Dr. Hamdallah Sedan from Egypt, who will address us on behalf of COP14 presidency. Dr. Sedan, you have the floor. Please press the button, raise your hand to be given the floor. Microphone for Dr. Sedan. Is there any representative from COP presidency? Well, while Dr. Sedan connects, I will give the floor later to him. We should continue. We have precious time. Meanwhile, I would like to invite the Executive Secretary, Ms. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, to deliver her remarks to this special virtual session of the SBSTA and to formally launch GBO 5. Please, Elizabeth, press the button, raise your hand to be given the floor. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me. Can you confirm if you can hear me? Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you all to today's special session, the first of the series of special virtual sessions of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice and subsidiary body on implementation. I sincerely thank you all for participating in these special sessions. Your virtual presence here today demonstrates your clear determination to maintain momentum of our efforts to conserve and protect nature. May I also offer my sincere thanks to Mr. Zedan, who will come later for his opening remarks. But up to where we've reached, we recognize his untiring efforts in support of the convention, especially in steering the Bureau and guiding us at the Secretariat through these difficult moments. I would also like to express my appreciation to you, Mr. Chairman, and to the entire SBSTA Bureau for your guidance and support in organizing this session. We are living through one of the most extraordinary threats to global health experienced in the past century, with its impacts felt across all nations. I would like us to join in expressing my sympathy and solidarity with you all, especially those among us who have lost loved ones from the impacts of this pandemic. Over the next 3 days, we will seek to facilitate preparations for the 24th meeting of the SBSTA and the 3rd meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation, which are currently scheduled to begin their work virtually later this year and to complete, hopefully, at physical meetings in the first quarter of next year. On the immediate horizon, these sessions will also help us raise the political profile of the Global Biodiversity Agenda ahead of the UN Biodiversity Summit, which will be convened by the President of the UN General Assembly on 30th September, as indicated also by our chair. Whether through the latest technology on our computer screens, through our traditional face-to-face meetings, or most likely the combination of both, we will summon up our resolves and continue faithfully on the path towards the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties incoming next year. There we will adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will set out a transformative and innovative plan to implement the broad-based action towards the 2050 vision. Today, at this special session of the SBSTA, we have come together to mark a historic milestone in the road to Kunming, China, and thus the launch of the convention's flagship report, the United Nations leading report on biodiversity, the Global Biodiversity Outlook. To understand what actions we need to take, we need a clear, authoritative assessment of where we are, where we need to go, and what we need to do to get there. This new 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Framework provides us with precisely the information we need. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all the parties, all individuals that have contributed to this Global Biodiversity Framework, the 5th edition, be it by submitting your 6th national reports, be it by providing peer review comments, or by sharing your expertise and knowledge. All are appreciated. As the acknowledgements in the report show, that this report is an output of the community that has rallied around the convention. I would also like to extend my thanks and sincere appreciations to the governments of Canada, European Union, Japan, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, whose financial contributions have made it possible for us to prepare the Global Biodiversity Framework. I now have the honor to formally launch our 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. In a few minutes, my deputy, David Cooper, will guide us through the contents of the report. But first, I'll take a few minutes to highlight some of the key messages emerging from the report. First, the stark conclusion of the Global Biodiversity Framework is that, unfortunately, none of the 20 Ihe Biodiversity Targets have been achieved in full. 6 of them have been partially met. That is, one or more of the sub-elements of the respective targets have been achieved. This is clearly disappointing and indicates that parties individually and collectively have not taken the actions necessary to reverse biodiversity loss, and thus biodiversity continues to decline. But I also want to stress that even where we have not met the targets, progress is being made by a number of countries, as the reports clearly set out. Perhaps most importantly, where policy measures have been put in place and where actions have been taken or have been implemented, they have delivered results. So clearly, policies do work. This and many other lessons are set out in the report. Distinguished colleagues, in the days ahead, we will come together to discuss our progress towards the new biodiversity, the new global pact to protect biodiversity, and also identify the pathways to make progress by 2030 towards the world's ultimate vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. Global Biodiversity Framework provides us with the vital information in this regard. It identifies the types of actions we will need to stem the loss and bend the curve and put biodiversity on a path of recovery. It identifies 8 vital areas of transition where these actions will need to be implemented. Ladies and gentlemen, the future of humanity depends on our determination to act now, with both urgency and compassion. Therefore, our discussions today could not come at a more important time. As SBSTTA is our body dedicated to technological advice, I expect their virtual nature will be no obstacle. I look forward to hearing your valuable insights and perspectives on this historic report. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Maruma Rema, for your warm welcome. And thank you for launching GBO 5. Now I know that Dr. Sedan is online. So I'm very pleased to have with us Dr. Hamdallah Sedan from Egypt, who will address on behalf of the COP14 presidency. Dr. Sedan, you have the floor. Please press the button, raise your hand to be given the floor. Seems difficulties with connection, so I'll give the floor to our colleagues from Secretariat. David Cooper, you have the floor to continue.
Thank you, Chair. And it seems that unfortunately Dr. Sedan is disconnected again, so I'm going to read his statement on his behalf. He's asked me to do that. Can I just confirm you can hear me?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
So, this is a statement on behalf of Dr. Sedan, distinguished delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Her Excellency, Dr. Yasmin Fouad, Minister of Environment for Egypt and President of the Conference of the Parties, it's an honor for me to welcome you to this special session of SBSTA for the launch of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. I trust that you and your loved ones are safe and well during these difficult times. I'd like to express my solidarity with all of you in all parts of the world as we battle this pandemic. Of course, the last time we met together at the second meeting of the Working Group for the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in February in Rome, we were preparing for our meetings of SBSTA and SBI in May, and for the third meeting of the Working Group in Cali, Colombia in June. Alas, like everyone else, we have had to continually adapt our plans. My colleagues in the Bureau and I, and in the SBSTA Bureau, together with the SBSTA and SBI chairs, the co-chairs of the Working Group and the incoming presidency, and with the support of the Secretariat, have done our best to maintain momentum in these challenging times. We have agreed that it would be useful to hold these special virtual meetings this week, as our chair has already outlined, to facilitate preparations for the full meetings of SBSTA and SBI when they can resume, and to provide some context ahead of the upcoming UN Summit on Biodiversity. While I'm sure that we all yearn to be able to meet together in one place, I know that I can count on all parties to participate actively in these virtual meetings to move our discussions and our agenda forward. As we chart this new path, it's inevitable, in fact, that there will be some hiccups, and I beg your indulgence and your patience. I'm confident that together, and with the professional support of the Secretariat, we will overcome any difficulties and have a successful series of sessions this week. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first meeting since the appointment by the Secretary General of the United Nations of Ms. Elizabeth Maruma as Executive Secretary of the Convention. I know that you will all join me in congratulating her on this appointment, and I know that I can speak for all of you in saying how pleased we are to have such a distinguished and capable person at the helm of the Secretariat at this particularly important time as we develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and prepare for COP15 in Kunming, China. I'd also like to take this moment to thank Elizabeth and her entire team at the Secretariat for the excellent and professional support to parties and to the CBD community at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here today as we launch the 5th and latest edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. As you know, the Conference of the Parties mandated the Secretariat to prepare GBO 5. And I know that Hamdallah is connected again. Maybe, Mr. Chair, you would like to see if he can complete the statement.
Please go ahead. Dr. Hamdallah, would you like to conclude the statement on behalf of co-presidency that David Cooper was delivering? You have the floor. Please press the button to raise your hand to be given the floor. Seems still technical difficulties.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Sedan. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry for this interruption. And of course, this is not strange, but as David said, that we have to be more patient with this. And I just would like to continue with what David has said, that the GBO 5 comes at a very critical time. Not only we are preparing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, but also countries around the world are developing their plans to recover from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The report contains a lot of information that will help countries as they seek to build back better. It is essential that as each of our countries implements its economic recovery efforts to rebuild economies, to strengthen healthy systems, the issues of climate, land, biodiversity, water be placed at the heart of these strategies. Dear colleagues, for decades, the world has been fighting to ensure the health and the prosperity of all people, to eradicate poverty, ensure good food and nutrition, clean water, education, employment, and to build strong and inclusive economies. We have been fighting to ensure that the natural world on which these are all depend, its climate, biodiversity, land, water, and oceans, are sustained for future generations. Unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic has challenged all these with immense impact on health, society, and economies. Our discussions this week ahead of the United Nations Summit are very timely. The summit will provide a unique opportunity to demonstrate ambition to accelerate action on biodiversity for sustainable development, and thereby give momentum to the development and the eventual adoption of an effective post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention in Kunming, China. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Hamdallah Sedan, and thank you to Her Excellency Jasmine Fouad, also for ongoing efforts in support of the convention since that incredible COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now I give the floor to Secretariat again, to Mr. David Cooper, to present us details on the presentation on GBO 5. Please, David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's an honor for me to present the GBO 5, to guide you through its contents. And I'd like to stress at the outset, this, although I'm presenting this is actually the result of a collective effort by many writers, researchers, translators, and of course, all of the parties in providing reports and in submitting comments and reviewing the draft as happened at SBSTTA-24. I hope that you can now see my screen. So, as Hamdallah mentioned, the mandate for GBO5 is to provide a report on progress to the Aichi Biodiversity Targets and the contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals, and to provide a basis for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And according to the mandate, of course, it should draw upon the 6 national reports, the IPBES Global Assessment, and many other inputs. And indeed, it does so. Some of the figures you can see on the screen here. We've analysed 167 national reports, as well as 170 NBSAPs for this Global Biodiversity Outlook. Of course, it very much builds on the landmark assessment from the IPBES published last year, but it is able to go beyond that, looking at more recent literature. And as we'll see, we have tried to focus very, very much also on data for the last 2 decades to really look at trends and changing trends during the period of the Aichi targets. The main report is divided into these 3 sections, and I shall go through them one by one. The first section gives an overview of the Aichi targets and the strategic plan, and then looks at the interactions between biodiversity, the Aichi targets, and the Sustainable Development Goals. We know already from the IPBES report that the decline of biodiversity jeopardizes many of those SDGs because the loss of biodiversity removes that essential contribution that biodiversity is making. But in the report, we also look at the way the SDGs support biodiversity by either contributing directly to reducing the drivers of loss or by providing an enabling environment through, for example, institutions, equity, education, gender equality, and so on. And we also look at those cases where care will be needed in implementation of SDGs and biodiversity objectives to ensure that they're supporting rather than limiting. The second part of the report is the longest part of the report and provides this assessment towards the Aichi Biodiversity Targets. For each of the 20 Aichi Biodiversity Targets, you will find an analysis set out on 4 or 6 pages, organised as you see on the screen here. For each of the targets, a summary is provided of progress to the target as a whole, and using this coloured half circle here to each of the elements. We also analyse the information from the national reports in terms of progress to national targets and in terms of examples of success. As I mentioned, the indicator-based charts focus in particular on data over the last 2 decades, and you'll see that we distinguish between these decades so that at a glance one can see the changes that are occurring. And of course, then there is a longer narrative report that is based on the literature. Just to explain a little bit more the analysis of progress towards the national targets. This is an example for target 9. We are showing with the colours here whether parties are reporting that they are exceeding the national target, blue, meeting it, green, making progress, yellow, not making progress, red, or going backwards, purple. But we also have done an analysis of the degree of alignment between the national targets and the global targets. And the darker the shade, the greater the alignment. So at a glance, you can see the overall trends. And if we look at the overall trends across the 20 Aichi targets, you can see, as we saw in the 4th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, that we are making progress, but that it's not generally sufficient to meet the national targets, and that many of the national targets are poorly aligned with the Aichi biodiversity targets. Looking at the overall assessment that draws on that assessment from national reports, but also on the literature, also on the IPBES assessment, and also on the full range of indicators, this is the overall scorecard. So here you see progress towards each of the elements of those 20 targets. We're using the same color code that we used in GBO 4. So you'll see that we achieved ratification of the Nagoya Protocol ahead of schedule. So that is indicated by blue. As the Executive Secretary pointed out, there's a few other targets that have been partially met. This means that at least one of the elements has been achieved and is green. So we have made progress in prioritizing alien species for action and preventing introduction. We have made a lot of progress in expanding protected areas at land and at sea. And indeed, we expect even more progress even in the coming days to report. And we are confident that these aspects of this target 11 have been achieved. We have updated national biodiversity strategies and action plans, as indicated here for target 17. We've seen a lot of progress on data and citizen science, and we have seen roughly a doubling of international flows to support biodiversity. On the other hand, there are some clear red areas where progress has not been made. And one notable area there that I'd like to highlight is that generally we have seen poor progress in addressing incentives that are potentially harmful to biodiversity. And in fact, we estimate that 500 billion a year is spent still on such subsidies. You'll see a lot of yellow here. This indicates progress is being made, but not at a sufficient rate to achieve the targets. But as the Executive Secretary mentioned, this does hide some real progress. And I think it's important that we look at the progress made and learn from it. So we are seeing, for example, almost 100 countries have incorporated biodiversity values into their national accounting systems aligned with international norms, showing progress towards target 2. Under target 5, while we have not achieved a 50% or more reduction in the rate of deforestation and loss of other habitats, we have seen that in the last 5 years, rates of deforestation are a third lower than they were last decade. So this is progress. We see in particular some significant progress over the decade in South America. For target 6, although we have still about a third of fish stocks being overfished, and the number is higher than it was when we reported on GBO 4, if we focus on those fisheries that have stock assessments, where we also have good management policies in place. This represents about half of all fisheries. We have seen, as this graph shows, increases in biomass, recovery of biomass as catch limits, enforcements of fishing management has been implemented, reinforcing the message the Executive Secretary gave. If we implement policies, they do work. And a clear indication of that is looking at Target 12. Certainly, as the IPBES report highlighted, endangered species continue to be endangered, and in fact, up to about 1 million species are threatened with extinction if we do not change track. However, conservation actions over the last decade and over the life of the Convention have reduced the number of extinctions. It's estimated they've prevented between 28 and 48 bird and mammal species from going extinct since the Convention came into force, and between 11 and 25 since 2010. So these areas marked as yellow, where we've seen progress, but not sufficient to achieve the targets. And of course, there are then those targets, which I'll go through very quickly, where we've actually achieved at least some element of the target. So with respect to invasive species, and of course, with respect to protected areas. And not only the total area, we've also seen increased coverage of key biodiversity areas. We've seen, of course, ratification, implementation of the Nagoya Protocol, fully operational globally and in at least 87 countries. We've seen major progress in updating national biodiversity strategies and action plans, but here there's also another lesson, because you will see that most of those plans were updated in around the middle of the decade, losing valuable time potentially for implementation. We've seen substantial increase in data and information available to citizens. And of course, as we've mentioned, we've seen international flows of biodiversity finance roughly double compared to the baseline of the 5 years before 2010. The overall lessons: we still need greater efforts to address the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And of course, to do this, we need great interaction among government ministries, economic sectors, and society generally. There's a number of other lessons that are listed there and detailed in the report. Turning now to part 3, looking at pathways to the 2050 vision for biodiversity, information that will be important perhaps as we develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Some very new work that we have drawn on, that was published in Nature last week, shows that to bend the curve of biodiversity loss on land requires not only investment in conservation and restoration action, but also changes in agricultural production and trade and consumption patterns. And if these are done, then it is possible, as you can see from the slide, for a number of indicators of biodiversity to bend the curve. Generalizing that and looking at how we put nature on a path to recovery at land and at sea towards the 2050 vision, we see that we need a portfolio of actions: conservation and restoration, also climate change. Business as usual scenarios show that even though land use change and overfishing are the largest drivers of biodiversity loss presently, climate change is projected to become so if we don't take strong action to keep climate change well below 2 degrees and close to 1.5. We will need to address other drivers of biodiversity loss as well, but we will only be able to bend the curve if we also look at sustainable production and consumption patterns. And the GBO 5 looks at how these different portfolio of measures can be played out in 8 areas of transition, listed here, looking at land and forests, looking at freshwater, looking at fisheries and oceans, looking at sustainable agriculture, looking at food systems, cities and infrastructure, climate action, and also looking at One Health. I won't have time to go through all of these in detail. In the report for each of them, the transition, you have a summary description, the rationale, the benefits, the key components of actions needed, and some examples of progress towards the transitions. They also highlight the linkages with other transitions. So on food systems, for instance, we need to be looking at rebalancing agricultural policies, and we need to be looking at how we can promote the availability, access, and consumption of diets that are both healthy and sustainable, as well as reducing food waste and encouraging businesses to promote sustainability throughout their supply chains. On climate action, this chart shows how all the other transition areas will be important in ensuring that biodiversity and ecosystems can play alongside and not replacing strong emission reductions. And one transition that was added since the discussions we had at SBSTTA-24 is this one, looking at biodiversity inclusive One Health. We know, and there's increasing evidence, some of it published this year, showing that as we degrade ecosystems, as we encroach upon natural areas, and as we promote unregulated wildlife trade, we increase the risk of future pandemics. We increase the risk of pandemics such as the one we are experiencing. We also know there are many, many other important linkages between biodiversity and health, and that many of the drivers of biodiversity are also drivers of ill health. We need a concerted, integrated, interdisciplinary approach to address these common areas. And indeed, all of these interactions are highly interrelated, as this graphic depicts. And to achieve change in each of these transitions, this will amount to the transformative change that was identified as necessary by the IPBES global assessment last year. That IPBES global assessment identifies some key leverage points where policies can make a difference. And in the report, we explain how these relate to each of the transition areas that I've just outlined. In summary and in conclusion, the status of biodiversity, we know that none of the Aichi targets have been fully met, but there are many examples of success. Policy measures do work. Looking forward, it is possible to reduce and reverse biodiversity loss and to put nature on a path of recovery towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. This requires strong conservation restoration action, but it also requires to address all the drivers of biodiversity loss and sustainable production and consumption patterns. Just as with the climate emergency and just as with the health emergency, the time for action is now. And indeed, action to reduce and reverse degradation of nature will help us achieve the climate agenda, the health agenda, and the broader 2030 agenda for sustainable development. These are all important lessons for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to present this report on behalf of the Secretariat, and we can address any questions that may come up a little later. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, David, for this presentation. There will be an opportunity for questions in a short while. Distinguished delegates, as you know, the Conference of the Parties also requests that the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook be prepared alongside with GBO5. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Joji Cariño of the Forest Peoples Program to make a presentation on the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook. Joji, please press on the button, raise your hand, and to be given the floor. You have the floor now.
Mr. Chairperson, esteemed colleagues, thank you for inviting me to speak at SBSTTA-24 on the occasion of the launch of GBO5. It is great to be meeting together, even virtually. I thought I was tired of CBD meetings, but I have actually been missing them lately. This meeting in particular has been long anticipated because today, the parties of the CBD and IPLCs from around the world will be telling our stories together from different vantage points. A global overview combined with country realities, scientific expertise combined with local outlooks on biodiversity. When COP13 in Mexico welcomed a second edition of Local Biodiversity Outlook to accompany GBO5, I felt that the decision marked a maturation in the relationship between parties and IPLCs around the world. Working on LBO2 has been an important undertaking for IPLCs in our engagement with the whole of the CBD. Parties, secretariat, scientists, civil society, and many other actors. Therefore, I wish to give thanks to all our collaborators and donors who have enabled the preparation, launch, and dissemination of LBO2. This is also the front matter of the publication. The collaborators, this is a joint publication of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, International Women's Biodiversity Network, the Centers of Distinction on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, the Forest Peoples Program, and the Secretariat of the CBD. We have multiple donors who enabled this to happen. The Secretariat of the Convention, the Government of Japan through Japan Biodiversity Fund, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the Government of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, the Ministry of the Environment of the Government of Finland, Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency through SwedeBio at the Stockholm Resilience Center, the Government of France through the Embassy of France to the United Kingdom, the Torres Strait Regional Authority in Australia, NIATERO, the Christensen Fund, Ford Foundation, and the Assembly of First Nations Canada. GBO 5 has just been presented to us, the latest analysis of global trends and status of biodiversity. In some ways, it is not a happy story. Some specific failures of our global political, economic, technological, cultural, and health systems have extracted too much of nature's wealth, and these have been laid bare, showing Earth's biosphere damaged and weak. This is one facet of the biodiversity story. LBO2 analyzes other facets of the biodiversity story. This report focuses on local biodiversity and stories of resilience, from speakers giving voice to the pains of Mother Nature as her children and healers. Indigenous peoples and local communities who are actively working with biological diversity, genes, species, and ecosystems as food, as relations, and as homelands. These voices are often quiet and unheard, and when loudly voiced, have been violently suppressed or silenced, as evidenced by the increasing number of indigenous human rights and environmental defenders being killed. This publication is dedicated to these heroes. LBO2 highlights over 50 stories by indigenous and local community authors from around the world, presenting the perspectives and experiences on the current social ecological crisis, and also their contributions to the UN Decade on Biodiversity, showing local solutions across biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. The report also identifies 6 critical transitions required towards achieving the 2050 vision. LBO2 also, the report also identifies 6 critical transitions required towards achieving the 2050 vision. Each story speaks to a vision and a commitment to building a better future driven by solidarity and collective actions to overcome current problems. So what are some of the findings and lessons contained in LBO2? Similar to most of the other Aichi targets under the current strategic plan, Aichi Target 18, relating to traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, has not been met. Only 10% of parties have reported including IPLCs in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And the adopted indicators and on traditional knowledge have not been applied. Ongoing disregard of IPLC's vital contributions to biodiversity conservation, restoration, and sustainable use has been a major missed opportunity in the past decade. And this neglect has affected the underachievement of all of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. Therefore, putting the cultures and rights of IPLCs at the heart of the 2050 biodiversity strategy could deliver sustainable livelihoods and well-being and positive outcomes for biodiversity and climate. This is strongly supported by evidence that IPLCs conserve sustainably use and manage biodiversity as a reciprocal relationship. In fact, peoples contributing to nature. LBO's second message is that overcoming separation and imbalances in the relationships between humans and nature is central to addressing the biodiversity and health crisis, including the rise of pandemics like COVID-19. Sustained partnerships are needed between sciences and indigenous and local knowledge to solve contemporary problems with holism and reciprocity. Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing inspire and evoke new narratives and visions of culture and nature working together within a living and sacred earth. LBO proposes 6 transitions on land, food, culture, governance, economies, incentives, and finance, which are very closely aligned to the 8 transitions proposed by GBO 5. Land, towards securing land and customary land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities. Food, revitalizing indigenous and local sustainable food systems. Culture, recognizing and respecting diverse ways of knowing and doing. Governance, inclusive decision-making and self-determined development. Economies, sustainable use of resources and the flourishing of diverse local economies. Incentives and finance, rewarding effective indigenous solutions and stop financing destruction. These are intergenerational visions honoring the historical struggles and wisdom of past generations, drawing on the experience and innovations of today's living generations, and embodying the legacy and hopes for future generations. They contribute to humanity's joint endeavor to save our common home. LBO authors and speakers will be giving substance to these compelling stories during a related event marking the formal launch of LBO 2, together with the Secretariat of the CBD. Do join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. for the formal launch, and please register at the CBD website. Thank you very much for your attention and support.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Joji. As you just said, it will be a more in-depth presentation of local biodiversity outlook tomorrow following the special virtual sessions of SBI. Delegates, as you know, the Conference of the Parties adopted an updated global strategy for plant conservation for the current decade, alongside with the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020. And that periodic plant conservation report is prepared to accompany GBO 5 to track progress in implementing the strategy. I will now like to give the floor to Susan Sharrock from Botanic Gardens Conservation International to make a presentation on the Global Plant Conservation Report. Please, Susan, press on the button, raise your hand to be given the floor. Susan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to share my screen. Just 1 second. I don't know. Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet. I can see it, but don't forget to touch the screen on Delegate, and you need to press the little triangle to play. You can see the presentation. At least I can see it.
Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, you can proceed,
okay.
Susan.
Fine, thank you very much. So, Mr. Chair, dear delegates, it's It's my pleasure to present the Plant Conservation Report on behalf of the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation. This provides information on the achievement of the objectives and targets of the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. The Global Strategy for Plant Conservation was adopted at COP6 in 2002 with the aim of halting the continuing loss of plant diversity worldwide. With 5 objectives and 16 targets, the strategy supports all aspects of plant conservation, from information generation and knowledge sharing, through conservation and sustainable use of wild plants and crop genetic resources, to capacity building, education and public awareness. The GSPC has provided clear, stable, long-term goals that have been adopted at global and national and local level by a wide range of stakeholders across sectors, including with strong support from the botanical community. Some parties, including a number of megadiverse countries such as China, Mexico and South Africa, have developed specific responses to the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, while other countries are implementing the GSPC through their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. In 2004, a Global Partnership for Plant Conservation was created to support parties in the implementation of the GSPC. The partnership currently includes over 60 leading international and national organizations and institutions. In Decision 710, the COP established a flexible coordination mechanism to promote implementation and monitoring of the strategy at all levels. The most recent liaison group meeting was held in Cape Town, South Africa in 2018, alongside a global partnership conference organized with the support of the CBD Secretariat and the South African National Biodiversity Institute. At the request of the CBD, in 2012, the partnership launched a GSPC toolkit in the 6 UN languages. This is managed by Botanic Gardens Conservation International. This slide illustrates progress towards each target at national and global levels. You can see that at the global level, the arrows indicate that only Target 1, World Flora Online, will be achieved by the end of 2020. However, it can be seen that progress is being made towards all the targets. The pie charts indicate progress as reported by over 60 parties as part of their 6th national reports. It can be seen that targets 1, e-floras, 2, red listing, and 14, public engagement, are the targets most likely to be achieved nationally, while target 7, in situ conservation, and 12, sustainable harvesting, are least likely to be achieved. The GSPC targets have promoted global responses and new initiatives. So, for example, GSPC Target 1, to have available an online flora of all known plants, will be achieved by the end of 2020 with the support of an international consortium creating the World Flora Online. The consortium is committed to continuing its work beyond 2020. Implementing Target 2 on conservation assessments has also made major progress, with work on the IUCN Red List and the launch of BGCI's Threat Search database that already includes over 300,000 plant conservation assessments at national and global levels. This has been of fundamental importance to help prioritise national actions. In addition, the Global Tree Assessment, an initiative led by BGCI and IUCN, and established directly as a result of the GSPC, will achieve the assessment of all 60,000 tree species by 2020. Other examples of progress on specific targets include national initiatives to identify and protect important areas of plant diversity in many countries and to conserve certain plant species within them. This slide shows some of the important plant area programs currently under development. The GSPC has stimulated considerable growth in networks and partnerships at national and global levels. For example, the slide shows a visualization of the network of partners contributing to plant red listing, Target 2, in Brazil. There are also a number of new thematic global consortia around specific targets, such as the Ecological Restoration Alliance of Botanic Gardens and the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership. We should ask what lessons can be drawn from 2 decades of the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. While most of the targets will not be fully met at the global level by the end of 2020, it is clear that more progress has been made than would have been made without the GSPC. We can also say that most progress has been made where we have smart targets that are supported by a focused and committed community. The importance of available and accessible data at national and global level also needs to be stressed. Capacity building initiatives have made extensive contributions to GSPC implementation, and many initiatives have been directly supported by parties. However, there is a clear need for greater alignment, linkages and reporting between the GSPC and other frameworks, notably the Aichi targets. The latest GSPC liaison group was invited to review progress on the GSPC and requested the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation to prepare information on options for integrating plant conservation into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Suggested recommendations for the future are that plant conservation should be clearly encapsulated in the context of a continued GSPC, updated and harmonized within the broader post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. New or updated GSPC targets would provide plant-specific milestones, indicators or sub-targets for this framework. Key focal areas for plant conservation going forward include ecological restoration, species recovery, sustainable use, and benefit sharing. The international plant community has been pleased to provide submissions and support to the CBD on a post-2020 plant conservation strategy, together with outlining options for how it can be fully integrated into the new Global Biodiversity Framework. Plant diversity is of immeasurable value to humanity, supporting all aspects of life on Earth. Concerted actions through the GSPC are safeguarding plant species and their habitats, and we remain committed to continuing this work in the framework of the post-2020 biodiversity agenda. I would like to finish by acknowledging the contribution of members of the GPPC to the preparation of this report, as well as the support provided by Missouri Botanical Garden and the ongoing encouragement we have received from the CBD Secretariat. Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to present this report on behalf of the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this presentation. The distinguished delegates, we already saw the presentation of Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 with these 8 transitions suggest. Also the Local Biodiversity Outlook with 6 transitions, and also the report on the Global Plant Conservation Report. Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to invite the Secretariat to give us some information in how to raise hands to speak and the overall use of the platform, including on accessing raise your hands to be given the floor. So, Secretariat, you have the floor. Sasha or who from Secretariat can give us a short explanation? Secretariat. Okay. Well, I understand that for request the floor you need to press the button of raise hand and you will be put on the list. Since we are running out of time, it will be a very short session for questions before giving the floor to statements from regions, parties, and major observers. This will be a very small round of few questions for presenters, and then we can proceed with this. I also remind you to don't forget to send your interventions in advance to interpreters. The usual email, statements@cbd.int. This is for the next part of our session to give interventions so interpreters can receive the information timely and help with the interpretation. I see that Sasha.
Yeah, the microphone is on now. Yeah.
Okay, you can proceed, Sasha.
Yeah, thank you, Sekir. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Just few tips how what you need to do to speak. If you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. It will turn yellow and your status will show hand raised. And please do not press twice on this button, as this will put you at the end of the queue. We will be notified of your request in our queue system. The chair will invite you to speak when it is your turn. You will see on your status bar, microphone open, and your speak button will flash in blue. Press speak button, it will turn red to live, which will turn on your camera as well and a microphone automatically. Wait for about 2 seconds, then proceed with your intervention. You may wish to ask the chair if you can be heard easily. When you are finished, please press the speak button again to turn off your live broadcast. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Secretariat. Now, as I said, it will be a very short round of questions. I see 5 people asking for the floor. Please be very concise in your question, and let's move to the next one. And when we have 5, then I will ask presenters to respond. So, IPLCBHCBO, you have the floor. Please be very brief. We cannot hear the intervention. Now I give the floor to Egypt for questions on 3 presenters. Egypt, you have the floor. Seems we need to get familiar with these technologies, and unfortunately time is running. I see.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I have very quick questions regarding how can we communicate the outcome of this important GBO 5 with the coming Biodiversity Summit. The situation, as it's very clear, is not good. How can you convince the world leaders to change their policies to biodiversity conservation? At the same time, how can we link the outcome of this meeting with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Egypt. Now I'll give the floor to Chile, followed by Germany. Chile, you have the floor. Ya puede hablar.
You may speak. You may go ahead, Chile.
Entiendo que su micrófono ya...
Do you see that your microphone is already open, Chile?
Si hay problemas de conexión.
There seem to be connection problems, so I'll give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. May I already give a statement for Germany, as time is running now, and I would like to give our statement. Distinguished Executive Secretary, distinguished SBSTTA Chair, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Germany would like to congratulate the CBD Secretariat on the launch of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. Like far too many other things this year, the publication of this landmark report has been impacted by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. As we continue to struggle with the current situation, the GBO 5 intensely reminds us that there is a crisis behind the crisis. The Outlook presents an alarming summary of our global efforts to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity over the last decade. It illustrates how far away we are from living in harmony with nature. With none of the Ihe biodiversity targets fully met at the end of the current strategic plan, what needs to change according to the GBO 5? What are the necessary steps to ensure a determined implementation of our next strategic plan, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? Mr. Chair, while GBO 5 highlights some achievements of the national and global levels, we take 3 main messages from the report. First, implementation of globally agreed targets will only be possible if national biodiversity strategies and action plans are aligned with and complement the global framework. At the same time, we need to better adapt our actions to the local level. Second, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework needs a robust reporting and reviewing system, from the global to the national, even down to the local levels. The different puzzle pieces, such as the IPBES global, regional, and thematic assessments, the CBD national reports, the global and local biodiversity outlooks, all need to constitute the whole picture. How successful we are in bringing all of these pieces together will determine our success in reviewing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in its entirety. And third, true transformative change will not be accomplished by defining smart targets only. The 8 GBO 5 transitions to sustainable pathways clearly spell out what needs to be done in various sectors. However, only defining pathways will also not guarantee that we reach the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Our biggest challenge lies in taking a whole of society approach that treats the biodiversity crisis with the same level of attention and action as a global pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Germany, I understand this intervention was on behalf of Germany. Originally, my plan was to receive just few questions for presenters and then to proceed with the interventions from and statements from parties and observers, starting with interventions on behalf of regions, and followed by major groups, and then for parties. Since we have 40 minutes only to do all these questions and interventions from regions, from major groups, and also parties, I will look for your cooperation. I ask for your cooperations to be very brief and to keep the time properly. As the usual practice, we will give 3 minutes for interventions at national level and up to 5 minutes for regional interventions or major groups. I will try to combine on the list questions and statements, and I will give the floor at the very end also to very short responses to presenters in order to optimize time. So I request your cooperation to be very straightforward and to keep and to explain if you are speaking on behalf of a region which will have priority on the list, and proceed with your statement. And as I said, you can also send it to the usual email so it can help to interpreters. I have Iran followed by Senegal. Iran, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You can proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and the Secretariat for arrangement of this virtual meeting. And also, I would like to thank to three excellent presentations, which we had very useful and informative. My question is on the GBO 5. That why is there any assessment that why most targets have not been met completely in several countries? Is there any assessment for that, or maybe the target for different country is not equal and achievable? And would it be possible for the next assessment to be considered and simplify the target for the next duration that would be applied for the implementation of the convention? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iran. Senegal, you disappear from my list. You have the floor. Go ahead, Senegal. We can see you. Now you disappear from my list, unfortunately. In order to be fair, I will give the floor now to Chile, who was trying previously to have the floor. Senegal, I can see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Ok, thank you. Il y avait un petit problème technique. Donc, c'est pour dire bonjour à tout le monde, de féliciter les présentateurs pour les présentations qui ont été faites et remarquer que finalement, aucune cible ne sera pleinement atteinte malgré tous les efforts qui ont été faits jusqu'à présent, ce qui veut dire qu'il y a encore du chemin à faire, il y a encore des efforts à faire. Par rapport au GBO 5,
We have noted that the target has not been achieved. None of the Aichi targets have been achieved. We heard this in the presentation. So the question is, the report that we heard, has this report been updated? And this is important in order to be able to compare what is in the report with what is actually happening on the ground. Thank you.
I will now give the floor to Chile, who had asked for the floor previously. Chile, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair. I have a small statement to make. And first of all, I'd like to thank and congratulate for the production and dissemination of GBO 5, which has been presented here today. We consider it be especially useful to give a brief introduction on the GBO and its main conclusions during the UN Biodiversity Summit and to outline the main features of the critical status of global biodiversity. We'd like to also highlight the importance of this global assessment because it contributes to the knowledge and evaluation of positive aspects and draws attention to the areas that have not achieved good recovery outcomes. We now have an opportunity to address these in this new stage with the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It should be widely disseminated to be used as a guide for countries to focus on designing and development of programs, strategies and regulations based on the recovery of specific ecosystems and especially economic recovery after the COVID crisis. In this respect, we would like to suggest to you the production of short videos giving key messages and fundamental findings in a simple and clear language that can be shared and go viral on social media networks. This would bring this content closer to the populations, thus contributing to environmental education and linkage with biodiversity and ecosystems. This will be another step forwards to start to live in harmony with nature. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Chile, and now the UK, and then Costa Rica.
Don't forget to indicate if you're speaking on behalf of any region, please. Microphone for UK, please. I see that, yes. You can take the floor, UK. Seems the camera is on, but not the mic. Si no, procedamos con Costa Rica en lo que...
Otherwise, we will proceed with Costa Rica while the UK is trying to connect. So could we give the mic to Costa Rica now, please? Please go ahead. We'd like to thank you for the efforts that have been made by GBO 5 and one of the main indications of the progress that has been made on natural protected areas. This is important because it's validation of the effectiveness of having these ambitious protected areas, and GBO has shown that Target 11 has helped us to take action in the world and have more natural protected areas established. And we hope that we will be able to protect 17% of the land and 10% of the oceans by 2020. considering the success that has already been achieved, I believe that we should be able to exceed this target. We have seen, however, that in the last decade, we have not been able to make significant progress to ensure that the protected marine areas are able to safeguard these important areas for biodiversity, which is representative of global biodiversity, which has to be managed in an effective way, and which has to be interconnected also with the landscape in general. The GBO has said that we have to increase the effectiveness of the natural protected areas, and this is in line with the scientific consensus that at least 30% of the earth and the oceans need to be protected by 2030. On the basis of these conclusions and recommendations, we would like to make some specific comments as to how we should examine the post-20 Global Biodiversity Framework. We believe that the conclusions of the GBO very much support this effort to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, and we really need to focus on natural protected areas because we've seen the effectiveness of this type of measure. We need to give priority to these natural protected areas where there's a great deal of biodiversity. We need to ensure that the protected areas are managed in an equitable way. This is part of Target 11 of Ihe Target. But it's also Action 2 for the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020. We need to make more progress with this target. In order to move ahead, we need to draw on this element laid out in the Action 2 for the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020. Now we're going to try again with the UK, and after you, South Africa.
We can see you and hear you.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for giving us a second attempt at the floor. We would like to thank the authors, the Secretariat, and all those who contributed to the production and review of this landmark publication. We are deeply concerned with the conclusions. Despite significant effort and good progress in some areas, we have not fully achieved any of the Ihe targets globally. Nature and the benefits it provides to us are in continued and steep decline. In particular, we note the conclusion that despite this failure, it is not too late to slow, halt, and eventually reverse these negative trends. The actions required are also crucial to the achievement of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. We must scale up efforts to conserve and restore biodiversity, keep climate change well below 2 degrees Celsius, including through expansion of nature-based solutions, reduce other pressures driving biodiversity loss, and achieve sustainable production and consumption. These are clear messages that must be communicated to the UN Biodiversity Summit and to other international events beyond the narrow sphere of biodiversity conventions. It is vitally important that we put into practice the lessons learned from our experience with the current strategic plan. In particular, global goals and targets must be formulated with clear and simple language and with quantitative elements to drive actions by all sectors of society. We must increase our ambition, update our MBSAPs, improve implementation and mainstream biodiversity across all sectors. We need a much more effective reporting and review mechanism that will track our individual and collective efforts and allow us to step up action where progress is insufficient to bend the curve. In conclusion, Chair, we welcome this report. It is a frank and sobering assessment, but we agree it is not too late to act. We are fully committed to working with all parties and stakeholders to put in place and implement an ambitious global framework, and we are committed to bringing nature to the forefront of discussions at the UN Climate Change COP, which we'll host in November next year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, UK. I remind you to speak slow and short as possible. We still have very limited time. Now I give the floor to South Africa, followed by Mexico. South Africa, you have the floor.
Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, we can hear you, South Africa. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. South Africa speaks on behalf of the Africa Group and notes the outcomes of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. It is almost 3 decades since the adoption of the CBD. However, the dramatic decline on biodiversity remains a crisis that continues to threaten nature and the well-being of people who depend on it. The rapid biodiversity loss also impacts upon countries' achievements of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook does show that none of the 20 key targets set by the CBD will be fully met by the end of 2020, and that only 6 of those targets were partially met. This report indicates areas of progress, of course, and also areas of concerns. The report aligns with the IBES Global Assessment Report on the State of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services published in 2019, which confirmed significant declines in biodiversity. The report pointed to a number of underlying direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss and recommended that transformative change is required to hold biodiversity loss and improve human well-being. The report suggests that some of the reasons for underachievement include lack of capacity and also lack of adequate resources, as well as other aspects associated with the framing, of course, of the targets. There is, however, considerable opportunity to translate lessons learned over the past 3 decades into meaningful and actionable recommendations for the future of biodiversity, nature, and people. This should include development of action-oriented targets that are smart enough to inform meaningful actions by parties to reduce biodiversity loss. Such targets must be supported by adequate and timely means of implementation, as well as capacity and technology. Mainstreaming of biodiversity into production and other sectors remains a priority if such targets are to be achieved. New efforts must be pursued should include integrated and coherent approach that simultaneously address loss of planet's genetic diversity, improves the capacity of nature to deliver benefits to human societies, promote people's well-being. It must also address the less tangible but highly valued connections between people and nature that help to define our identities, cultures, and beliefs. In conclusion, Chair, we draw the attention of the meeting to the current COVID-19 pandemic and want to highlight the risks and opportunities presented by nature. The risks are mainly dependent on how we manage biodiversity, and so are the opportunities too. Therefore, the journey towards the vision of 2050 of living in harmony with nature by 2050 is in our hands. We thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, South Africa, on behalf of the African region. Now I'll give the floor to Mexico, followed by Sweden.
Thank you. Chair, can you hear me well? Perfect. Go ahead. Thank you. The Mexican delegation very much congratulates the Secretary and SBSTTA for the preparation of Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. We also wish to say good day to all of the delegates and hope that you and your families are doing well. The pandemic caused by COVID-19 has highlighted how urgent it is to deal with the relationship with nature as a priority, because if we don't do that, we will be jeopardizing our own survival. Even if we would have liked to have met in Canada for the launch of this document, we very much agree with the decision to publish it before the Biodiversity Summit. This is an event that should give considerable impetus to the global commitments that we need to make to halt biodiversity loss. In this respect, we wish to emphasise the fact that the main outcomes of GBO5 are not very encouraging when it comes to achieving the G targets, as we've just seen. If we remain on the current path, the biodiversity and the services which it provides to us will continue to be reduced. This will put at risk the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and the well-being of our societies. However, the GBO also presents encouraging transitions that, if implemented, would give us a more sustainable future. So we need to unite our efforts and achieve a post-2020 framework with goals and targets that will promote actions in favour of our lands, forests and oceans. This will ensure the sustainable use of water in agriculture, combat climate change and strengthen human health and ecosystems. Mexico is calling for the information contained in GBO 5 to be considered in the development of the post-2020 framework so that countries achieve the necessary agreements to get out of this environmental crisis, which has unfortunately been exacerbated this year. And therefore, now more than ever, we need to redouble our efforts. Thank you very much, Chairman, and congratulations. Thank you, Mexico.
Sweden. We can hear you. We can see you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Thank you, honored delegates. First of all, our tributes go to the CBD Secretariat and all the authors and contributors to this excellent report that was produced in the most difficult of times. We are living through a global crisis that very few could imagine only 1 year ago. Some of us have already felt it to the skin. Some others have been in more fortunate situations. Our thoughts go now to those struck and affected everywhere. The biodiversity crisis is not nearly as well recognized by the whole of society. In the long run, however, it could have much more devastating and long-lasting effects for the global society if we don't stop the negative trends and bend the curve. The loss of biodiversity is interdependently connected to other global challenges like climate change, land degradation, food security, and our own health. The GBO 5 now shows again how urgent, determined responses by government, but also by the whole of society are. When looking for solutions to the different crises that face humanity at this point in time, it is clear that biodiversity offers the solutions or important parts of the solutions to many of them. As the biodiversity community, it is our task to find the most effective ways to communicate this fact to the rest of society. Crises of different sorts will certainly follow humanity also into the future. We cannot foresee the nature and severity, but the need to respond will be ours. The obvious response is to build more resilience into societies, making them shock-proof to the effects of unforeseen events. To do this, biodiversity restoration and wise use is essential, along with achieving and protecting social assets such as democracy, equality, justice, and education for all. Let us now join virtual hands to work together on the path to Kunming and to achieve the vision of the Biodiversity Convention, living in harmony with nature. Yes, we are responsible for the future of humankind that still offers so much promise for coming generation if we just can manage to stand up to the present challenge. Greetings from the Swedish delegation, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Sweden. Given that we have only 15 minutes to finish our meeting, I would now like to open the floor for brief 3-minute statements by representatives of major groups. Sorry for not giving the floor to other parties, but I hope you understand the situation. And we're learning to use these new technologies. I will give the floor to representative of indigenous peoples and local communities, so IPLC-BH CDO. I hope the connection works well. So you have the floor. IPLC-BH CDO. You're allowed to open, but since your mic is not, yes. We cannot hear you yet. If we cannot connect, I'll give the floor to representatives of youth. The YBN, you have the floor. Yes.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and we express our appreciation towards the Secretariat and everybody involved in the development of the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook that sheds some light on the path towards creating a healthier, more equitable and inclusively prosperous future. The information and compelling evidence presented in this outlook reinforces calls for system-wide transformative change, which is our only shot at a future of living in harmony with nature. As GBO rightly puts, humanity stands at a crossroads with regard to the legacy it leaves to future generations. If the current generations are already suffering the consequences of our crumbling life support system, that is, the biodiversity crisis, what will life be for the generations to come? Our generation is aware of how vital biodiversity is to human society. Our aspirations and ideals for a healthier relationship between nature and humanity are not just driven by ideas of compassion, justice, and hope, but also by the pure necessity and fear of the consequences and failure. We need you to recognize young people as key stakeholders and actors in decision-making at every level, because with the full and effective participation of young people in environmental decision-making, and with the recognition of intergenerational equity, we can assure you that the next edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook will be able to tell a more progressive story. For this, let us build on the success stories highlighted in the GBO 5 and draw imperative lessons from the identified failures. Let us also create strengthened and renewed multilateralism that, as the UN Secretary General said, is built on trust, that is built
key messages of the submissions, see them examples of progress, new learnings for achievement of the HCB targets.
Technicians, can you send back microphone to youth, and then we will proceed with IPCL.
Thank you.
You can continue, please.
Thank you. To pick up on, let us create strengthened and renewed multilateralism that, as the UN Secretary General said, is built on trust, that is based on international law and is geared towards the overarching goals of peace and security, human rights and sustainable development. Importantly, we'd also like to point out that while the GBO gives us a global picture of the progress made towards biodiversity commitments implementation, it will remain incomplete and inaccurate until local perspectives and the inclusion of the voices of grassroots movements and other actors on the ground are generally accounted for. Ensuring this in the GBO and continuing to support initiatives such as the local biodiversity outlooks will make the difference in reporting of global biodiversity outcomes. To conclude, as we collectively strive to build back better from the current COVID-19 pandemic, not tackling biodiversity loss at the systemic level is likely to restore our world to business as usual, which is just as vulnerable to another crisis like COVID-19. We're running out of time, but together, working across the generations, we can create the world we all want and deserve. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, representative of youth. Let's go back to representative of indigenous peoples and local communities, followed by representative of Women Caucus. We need to be very efficient in the remaining minutes. Please try to be very brief. So can we go back to representative of indigenous peoples and local communities? So that you start your intervention while youth was delivering their own. If it's not the case yet, can we try with representative of Women Caucus? Please go ahead. Adelante.
Thank you, Chair. I am Amelia Reguin, speaking on behalf of the CBD Women Caucus, an alliance representing women, grassroots women, organizations and networks and their agencies, in working to advance women and girls' empowerment and gender justice in the work of the CBD. Frustration is bound to creep into the eyes when reading the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which marks the end of an era, the Aichi era. Thoughts about insufficient efforts constantly start to haunt our heads as we read through the document. And many questions arise regarding what has to happen so that as humanity, we react to the biodiversity crisis and act with enough ambition to move towards coexistence with nature and collective equitable action. As women's constituency, another worsening trend that deeply concerns us is the continuous invisibility of our rights, contributions, and priorities in biodiversity realm. We are deeply concerned about the growing gender-based violence in the environmental sector, particularly against women and girls who defend their land and territories. We call attention to the increase in workloads due to the gender unfair division of labor in the biodiversity sector, as well as the dangers associated with misnamed natural disasters resulting from ecosystems degradation. These trends concern us mainly because the rising curve of inequality and the curve of biodiversity loss combined hinders women and girls from enjoyment of their full life and the right to a healthy environment. The GBO 5 highlights that there is a need to strengthen further the integration of gender, the role of IPLC, and the level of stakeholder engagement. It notes that the NBSTAP submitted to date, gender considerations are reflected by only 76 parties. We acknowledge the efforts that some parties are making to address gender considerations in biodiversity policy, but more needs to be done. Women and girls are more than a reference, they are more than a word. They are half the population and the agents of change in sustainable use of biodiversity. They are the first-line actors in the management and conservation of biodiversity. They also are key knowledge holders and play an integral role in the intergenerational transfer of knowledge and genetic diversity conservation. Women and girls should be fully integrated in the such transition strategies proposed by GBO 5. Some recommendations presented in the GBO 5 are welcome, but now the task is how those considerations will be further implemented within the post-2020 GPF and how the new gender plan of action can help turning these recommendations into actions to ensure social, economic, and environmental justice of and for women and girls in biodiversity sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, representative of Caucus, Women Caucus. Last interventions from non-parties will be CBD Alliance. You have the floor.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to all around the world connected now. This is Gadela Vadens speaking from the rainy La Paz, Bolivia. I'm going to switch to Spanish for my intervention for the interpreters and for those who want to switch the language up there in your screen in the audio channel selector. So, brief. Primero,
first of all, we would like to express our solidarity with all those who are suffering under the pandemic, in particular the most vulnerable groups. We'd like to express our solidarity, and we hope that this will be an opportunity for governments and countries to change the paradigm and change their development models. Secondly, thank you for the efforts that have been made to hold these virtual sessions and to ensure active and equitable and fair participation for everyone, because we do not all have the same privileges. We need to be able to walk in each other's shoes. I have a few brief comments, in fact, 4 questions that I'd like to put. First of all, on the question of the text that talks about conservation and restoration as nature-based solutions. Our question is, why, when we're talking about the conservation measures, we're putting it in a context that is not defined in the CBD and which causes problems in civil society and also amongst delegates of various countries? I just have 3 questions. Secondly, in the text, there is no reference to rights. Even if we've got a very lengthy text, there is no reference to rights. We'd like to know why you've decided not to refer to any rights at all in the text. Also, another question. When you present joint scenarios between different agendas and the possibility of bending the curve and reaching 2050 targets, in this analysis, are there any differentiated responsibilities between developing and developed countries? Because we don't see that difference in the text. And finally, to round off this intervention, in the light of what's been presented in the report, we need to look at the structural underlying causes for biodiversity loss, which is caused by various actions undertaken by humanity. And I think we need to focus on these structural causes rather than just talking about selling ecosystem services and perhaps not actually taking our responsibilities. Thank you very much to the CBD Alliance.
Run out interpretation in 2 minutes, so we can continue only in English for few interventions more. I will give the floor to our next COP presidency, to China, to deliver a short intervention. Please, China, you have the floor. And also the next very last intervention will be Aichi Alliance, representing subnational and local governments. But as I said, we will continue a few minutes in English, only once translation finished in a couple of minutes. China, you have the floor. China, can you try? We can hear you. Go ahead. Please proceed, China. since we lost China and was speaking in Chinese, and we are out of translation, unfortunately. If China would like to speak in English, we will appreciate. Meanwhile, we tried with the last intervention from subnational and local governments with Aichi Alliance, while we try to connect again with China.
Just to announce that the English interpretation will now stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Chair and distinguished delegates. I'm taking floor on behalf of the Global Network of Subnational and Local Government. Firstly, we would like to congratulate the team of GBO for the successful launch of GBO 5 report. We hope this marvelous report will help the ongoing discussion on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, an amazing achievement to be done at COP15 in China. COP10, held in Aichi, Nagoya, gave birth 10 years ago to the Strategic Plan 2011-2020, including the Aichi Biodiversity Target. But the meeting also adopted the Plan of Action on subnational government, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity in the Division 1022. Over the past decade, subnational and local government and their networks have achieved a lot individually and collectively. These efforts and achievements have contributed to be in line with those of the parties. That is why actively and formally involving subnational and local government is one of the priorities we should be pursuing in this and future decades. At SBI2, we made a call for parties to cooperate with subnational and local government into their 6th national report. Therefore, we are glad to find the GBO 5 recognizes the importance of cities management and subnational planning. Such mentioning encourages us to act more in the coming decade. We sincerely hope the ongoing preparation process toward COP15 would consider a more ambitious role and more recognition of the importance of subnational and local government in implementing the new framework. A webinar on the role of subnational and local government in the post-2020 framework is going to be held on 23rd September. As notified by SCBD on 10th September, we would be pleased if many parties and other stakeholders take this opportunity to discuss how the CBD could best work together with the subnational and local constituency over the coming decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Aichi Prefecture, with this we finished with interventions. We heard a lot of interventions welcoming the report, very concerned about the situation globally on biodiversity and the importance to really act now to do our best all together. Before closing, I'd like to leave some final remarks. I reiterate that the key message of the report that when implement policy and management interventions work, and that science and modeling are telling us that transformational change is possible. If we all work closely together, so we need to use this positive message to further encourage everyone to take action in all. In particular for the 8 transitions to living in harmony with nature. We hear about land and forests, water, fisheries, agriculture, food, cities, climate change, and health. And this launch happened in advance of the UN Biodiversity Summit next September 30 to use these elements of GBO 5 and especially key messages from the summit to inform national interventions during the summit. I also invite parties and observers to fully use GBO5 during next steps in preparation for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Encourage parties on all interested stakeholders to use GBO5 and its finding intercommunications in support of taking urgent action on biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Widely disseminate results, including through education and awareness programs and initiatives. Finally, I do thank to the team working on the GBO5, in particular David Cooper, all contributors, and also who provide valuable comments and suggestions during the review periods. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of our session. Tomorrow at the same time, it will be a special session on SBI, on testing, on party-led review process through an open-ended working group, with Charlotte Sorkis will be the chair. And thank you all for your participation today. We're learning by doing. A special virtual session of this SBSTTA meeting is now closed. Thank you very much.